I'm Kevin Davis in this family podcast. Thank you all for being with us today. And thanks to our guest, Mr. Louie Verrecchio, who has joined us several times in the past. We always love having him on. We always recommend that you go over and check out his material over at akacatholic.com. He also has a YouTube channel that we will, of course, link in the show notes where he really does all sorts of different things. I've seen several times. I think your last thing was kind of another investigative journalism going into the Knights of Columbus. Was that your latest video, Louis?
Yeah, it was my latest
One of the
video
yeah.
about the unholy marriage between the Knights of Columbus and March for Life in the United States, and they're
Fascinating.
selling abortion. It's scandalous. Yeah, it's
Crazy. Well,
really.
and it's again, it's why we appreciate you, and as everyone knows, again, that you're one of the few who left the easy, cushy side and kind of went to the side of truth, even though maybe it was giving up some of the worldly goods, I suppose, and we appreciate that. So definitely check him out. And today we're going to talk about the Declaration of Human Rights, which is back in the 1940s. Louise was telling me before the show, and it sounds really fascinating, and kind of how this government given human rights kind of connects down to today, and how the church, or the anti-church, I suppose you can call it, has reacted throughout the age. And so, Louis, without further ado, thank you very much as always for coming on, and take it away.
Always great to be here, Kevin. And I think this is a timely conversation. Of course, it's been timely for years on end and will remain so for a while. But it's somewhat timely right now because just about a week ago, the United Nations held another one of its summit meetings, rallying the troops to push forward Agenda 2030 with increased urgency, to implement these sustainable development goals that are utterly irreconcilable with Christian culture and the Catholic faith, but you wouldn't know it if you're confused to the point where you think the conciliar church in Rome is the Holy Roman Catholic Church, because they're standing behind it 100%. And to get a sense for just how far away from Catholic thinking the conciliar church is in this regard from the Holy Roman Catholic Church, probably a good idea to turn our attention back to this document that you mentioned that was created by the United Nations in 1948, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that on occasion I'll refer to as UDHR for short. And when this document came out, it's noteworthy that Pope Pius XII didn't praise it at all. They met with a stony silence on the part of the Holy See. Now, in hindsight, you might look back and say, once we start getting into the meat of this declaration and its offensiveness against Catholic sense, you might question, well, why didn't he come out and condemn it explicitly? Well, the answer is because the teachings of the Holy Catholic Church have been consistent throughout the centuries about the centrality of Christ with regard to the ordering of society. And if you look at his magisterium, he's just simply repeated often that Christ is the center of society and divine law has to be the ordering principle of society. Otherwise, we fall into chaos. And so he really had no need to even give the United Nations the honor of being mentioned directly. So I put that out there as a preemptive strike because there is a thread of thought out there that wants to try to use Pius XII as a transition from what the church has always taught about the central role of the sovereign rights of Christ the King and the ordering of society, as though he's a transitional figure leading to the point where the church itself could endorse something like this UDHR. So with all of that said, I want to get into some of the meat of this document, and it will immediately become clear to our viewers why it's irreconcilable with the Catholic faith. So this document starts with a preamble, and it's a series of whereas statements that serve as the foundational basis for the principles that are to come. And it begins with this statement: whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And it goes on. Now, this statement is probably obvious to viewers of this podcast why that's irreconcilable with Catholic doctrine, because it's not recognition of the inherent dignity of human beings that will lead to freedom and justice and peace in the world. As Pope Pius XI wrote in Quas Primas, just some 23 years before this UDHR was written, he stated, when once men recognize, both in private and public life, that Christ is king, It's then that society will at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, well order, discipline, peace, and harmony. Now, it's interesting to me, the words that are used in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, some of them are taken directly from this statement from Pius XI and Quas Primas. Now, do I believe that the people who authored the Declaration of Human Rights for the UN were cognizant of the fact that they were taking some words literally from Quas Primas and turning them around? And instead of saying recognition of Christ is the pathway to peace and freedom, and saying directly, no, recognition of human rights is the pathway to freedom and justice and peace. Did they realize what they were doing? I would say probably not. But I would follow that up by saying that the real motivator and the force behind this document knew. The evil one sure as heck knew. And so what I see in the fact that it uses many of the same words to sell man and his dignity as the key to freedom, justice, and peace is the fact that the devil's pulling the strings here. He's the one that's guiding this. It's a diabolical operation. So the UDHR, it predated Vatican II by roughly a decade and a half. And from the time that it was written, 1948, when it was very clear where the church stood with regard to the ordering of society and the true pathway to peace, harmony, and justice being Christ the King and his kingship, at Vatican II, we find a wholesale endorsement of the humanism that's at play in the UDHR. And that's primarily witnessed in the document Gaudium et Spes, which states the preposterous notion that all things on earth should be related to man as their center and crown. Now, we're going to see how we transitioned from 1948 to 1965 as this preamble goes on. I want to highlight some more of the things it says. It goes on to say, the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Now, that's a statement clearly that we can't, as Catholics, endorse. Why? Because the highest aspiration of the people is what? Communion with God in eternity. That's the basis for human dignity. By the very fact that he calls us to communion in eternity with himself, that's why human dignity exists. And the degree to which we cooperate with God's plan of salvation such that we might attain to this communion, that's the basis of our human dignity. We can lose it. We can nurture it. We can grow in dignity. Now, I'm going a little off topic here, but I think it bears mention that, human dignity gets cited so often that many of us, even sincere Catholics, have the mistaken impression that human dignity is something that all of us share in some equal measure. Well, there is a basic dignity that we share because we're created in the image of God, but because we lost the likeness to God through original sin, we don't all have the same degree of human dignity. And to put it in context, Padre Pio, for example, his human dignity was well above that of, let's pick somebody, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, your next door neighbor, me, you. We all don't have the same degree of human dignity. It's not a constant. And so when you say that the highest aspiration of the common people is to enjoy a world of free speech and free belief, freedom from fear, no, you're taking human dignity away from its source. That's not our highest aspiration, obviously.
Well, and even bringing in this free speech part of it, right? That's not a Catholic belief either. We're not free to say anything we want. That's also obviously not the case. And so it seems like almost word for word, it's kind of like, well, nope, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't fit.
Right, exactly. So freedom of speech and freedom of belief. And It's interesting. These are things that freedom of belief that was specifically endorsed by the Council in Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration of Religious Freedom of Vatican II. But you're 100% correct, Kevin. That part of it alone makes this thing objectionable and condemnable, really, from a Catholic standpoint. The UN goes on to say, whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in their charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights. I'm going to stop there. Look, when your faith is placed in fundamental human rights, obviously they're misplaced. Our faith is in the Lord, and if your faith is in fundamental human rights, the question that needs to be asked is, well, who do we look to as the highest authority in determining what those rights are? Well, the UN is pleased to give us the answer when it states, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve in cooperation with, not the plan of God, but cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the pledge here is to the United Nations as if it is the highest authority in the land and as if it is the source of communion among men. So, in essence, the United Nations Declaration here on human rights is essentially a manifesto seeking to replace the mystical body of Christ in the world as the highest authority with respect to what human rights are and what they are not. Okay. And the source of communion of all mankind. So, in essence, what we're seeing here is that the guiding light for arriving at this proposed common understanding of human rights is man himself. It's man himself, self-referential. One of
Well,
the other things, I'm
sorry,
sorry,
real quick. Just interesting because when you get into humanism, I think it often goes into socialism or communism, and eventually it's just because if you start putting your trust in men, men always go down the wrong path. I mean, that is throughout history that is always the case. I mean, so it's kind of a remarkable thing, really, that they've even been able to trick anybody into these ideas of I mean, human rights based on what the UN says it. And as you say, who's the UN? And let's even say that for 50 years they've been just and good and I mean, remarkably peaceful. Okay. Until I mean, is that going to be forever? As you say, you have to put these things from God because men are going to fail. Have to.
absolutely. I mean, a lot of sincere people who really want to be Catholic have lost sight of the fact that we're fallen, and so given a choice, we're going to veer toward the evil ultimately, unless we have a mother, teacher, and guide, and the person in which that guidance is possessed individually, most proximately, is the Pope of the Holy Roman Catholic Church to keep us on the sure path. We need that. Apart from that, it's just sheer liberalism, and we're going to choose the evil more often than not. That's part of our fallen condition. The UDHR goes on to say, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Utterly irreconcilable with Catholic doctrine. Catholic doctrine has consistently insisted that all authority comes from God, all of it. So, I mean, there's many things that we could point to contrast that ridiculous statement about authority coming from the people to put a Catholic spin on it, but I don't think it's necessary for our audience. So I'm going to kind of move through this a little bit more quickly and get now to the point where, as I had stated, Pius XII, he had nothing to say about this UDHR. It was met with stony silence, and his silence on this document alone said something to the world. It was noteworthy. And even though some people want to point to Pius XII as a transitional figure and they search desperately for seeds of the UDHR in his magisterium, they are not there. And rather than go into detail about that, I would just encourage any viewers who come up against that opinion, just do your homework. Scour the magisterium of Pope Pius XII, and you won't find any justification for what's in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Moving on, though, to the post-conciliar claimants to the papacy, these men had quite a bit to say about the UDHR. John the 23rd, for example, he called it an act of the highest importance performed by the United Nations, approved in their General Assembly of December 10, 1948. In the preamble of that declaration, which we've been discussing, the recognition and respect of those rights and respective liberties is proclaimed as a goal to be achieved by all peoples and all countries. For in it, in most solemn form, the dignity of a human person is acknowledged to all human beings. Glowing assessment. Paul VI, he weighed in on the UDHR, saying, when this eminent international assembly prepares to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the UDHR, we want to seize the occasion once more to express our great confidence in, and at the same time our firm accord with, the consistent commitment of the United Nations in the promotion, ever more precise, more official, and more efficacious, of the respect of the fundamental rights of man. As we have affirmed elsewhere, the Declaration on the Rights of Man remains in our eyes one of the most beautiful titles of glory. Now, I apologize to viewers for reading such lengthy quotes, but I think it's important to get a sense for just how passionately, the post-conciliar claimants to the chair of St. Peter have lined up to endorse and applaud this document that's totally irreconcilable with even basic Catholic doctrine.
Well, and did
Now,
either of them mention the word God? Maybe I missed it, but I don't feel like they did.
no,
I mean,
and
it seems like the Pope maybe should sneak it in, try to sneak in God a little bit into the comment, right?
yeah, maybe here or there. And I have to say, even if they did inject in some way this generic sense of God, this is the vicar of the God man, Jesus Christ. Okay. It's not enough for a true pope to just generically invoke God, because that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And the fact of the matter is, the kingship of Christ is possessed by Jesus Christ as man in the strict and proper sense, to quote Pius XI. Point being, it's all authority belongs not to a generic God, but to this God man, Jesus Christ. All authority has been given to him. So for a true pope, it's poping 101, to be able to point to Jesus Christ, the God man, who truly walked this earth some 2,000 years ago and ascended in glory, that he's the focal point of all of history. He's the centerpiece around which all of society needs to be constructed, or it's going to fall flat. Now, Paul VI, he was speaking in 1973 when he gushed about this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as one of the most beautiful and glorious documents ever produced by man. But even before that, viewers will remember that Paul VI, he was the first claimant to the chair of St. Peter to appear at the United Nations. And it was at that time that he said, quote, "The peoples of the earth turn to the United Nations as the last hope of concord and peace." Amazing. The last hope of concord and peace in the world is the United Nations. It's not Jesus Christ. It's not his mystical body on earth, the church. And it was only 2 months after that, the Vatican Council II passed the document Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration of Religious Freedom. And we've talked about this document before, I think, and if not, I've written about it extensively. But viewers familiar with that text will recall that the basis for this so-called right to religious freedom that's articulated by the council is based not in God and the rights that he grants to man, but based in human dignity alone. So, the Conciliar Church is 100% on board with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. John Paul II, of course, he followed suit. He stated, "I'm particularly pleased to join in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, being held by the United Nations, the guardian of one of the most precious and important documents in the history of law." Amazing, right? Now, when we get to Benedict XVI, he also spoke in person at the United Nations, and he began speaking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by talking about how important it is to recognize human rights and that the human person lies at the heart of our institutions, laws, and the workings of society, and so on. And if he had stopped there, the assembly would have been rather pleased with his commentary, but he did, to his credit, go on to say that the rights recognized and expounded in the Declaration apply to everyone by virtue of the common origin of the person, who remains the high point of God's creative design. So you can see in his commentary that Benedict XVI, to his credit, is trying to lend a little bit of perspective to so-called human rights by pointing to their origin, and that is God, of course. And he goes on to say, removing human rights from this context would mean restricting their range and yielding to a relativistic conception. And he went on. But so it's to his credit that he tried to lend at least a godly perspective to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which totally avoids the idea that our rights come from God. And you might have, walked away from those comments thinking, hey, maybe there's some hope. Maybe the Conciliar Church is about to have a little corrective and will become Catholic again. But then 2013 comes, Benedict flees for fear of the wolves, and on the scene comes Jorge Bergoglio, who picks up the mantle of Paul VI and John the 23rd. And he begins gushing, of course, about this declaration. For his part, he says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms, and now here he quotes the preamble that you and I already discussed, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, end quote. So the first preamble that you and I talked about as being so obviously and utterly condemnable from a Catholic perspective, because Christ the King and recognition of his sovereign rights is truly the pathway to freedom, justice, and peace. He quotes it specifically and endorses that specific part of the preamble. So he's essentially getting right behind the idea, 100% verbatim, saying, yeah, the United Nations, that's the source of authority in the world. It's recognition of human rights that's going to be the pathway to peace, not Christ the King. He also went on to say, respect for the dignity of each human being is the indispensable premise for all truly peaceful coexistence. Again, directly contradicts what Pius XI taught about the sovereign rights of Christ the King and recognition of his sovereign rights. He also went on to say, and this is very Bergoglian, he says, from a Christian perspective, there's a significant relation between the gospel message and the recognition of human rights in the spirit of those who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That kind of a commentary is right up his alley. He's actually going just a little bit further than his predecessors. They applauded the document, but Francis is going a little bit further by saying the document is actually based in the gospel message, that it's drawn from sacred scripture in a sense. It's not surprising. I mean, Bergoglio, from the moment he stepped on to that loggia on forward, has been manipulating sacred scripture to his own ends. But he's the first among his predecessors to say that it's truly drawn from a gospel message, which is preposterous. So, Kevin, that's the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of the United Nations of 1948. And I think it's pretty clear to everyone why it is irreconcilable with Catholic thought and why Pope Pius XII, the last person that we can confidently look at as being the Holy Roman Pontiff and Vicar of Christ, had no praise for the document whatsoever, in contrast to the men who followed him.
Well, I think it's something that I recommend people go check out another podcast you and I did. I'll try to remember to link that about how Bergoglio is a loyal son of Vatican II, and I think it all you see again how this all connects together, and I think that's why it's important. I think we're going to talk about a bit about how this affects us today, maybe a little bit, but I think that you see it all goes back. I mean, all of what Bergoglio does now, maybe he takes it a little step farther. He's a little more extreme, I suppose, but these are not new ideas. This, as you say, that this document was back in 1948, and everyone I mean, I guess Ratzinger not quite as much, but the others were fully supporting it. I think it's a perfect example to see again that the roots of the rot don't start with Bergoglio. That is totally not the case. So again, go check out that other video. I'll link below. Really good stuff. Again, that was with Louie a couple months ago. But I know, Lou, you want to talk a little bit about how this is affecting us today, I suppose. I mean, the human rights issues we've heard obviously the last decades. I think it gets more and more prevalent in the lingo. I mean, where is it going, do you think? What's the ultimate goal, I suppose, of the UN?
So this UDHR, it became obviously kind of like a manifesto for the UN and this idea of universal human rights, and they get to define what the rights are, and when my rights offend against the rights of the common good, and so on and so forth. And it's starting to culminate now in what is Agenda 2030. I know people, we hear about that a lot. We hear about sustainable development goals, and that's the fruit of this UDHR. That's where all of this was tending. And it's timely, as I mentioned at the beginning, because the UN recently held what they called a high-level political forum on sustainable development. This meeting took place September 18 to 19, so just several days ago. And the Unholy See is 100% on board with it, obviously. They sent a message on behalf of the Vatican by way of an Archbishop Gallagher, who works for the Secretariat of State. And he sent a message to this meeting which was held to add urgency to Agenda 2030 and the attainment of these sustainable development goals. And he began his statement by recalling an address that Francis gave to the UN in 2015, where he said, quote, he described the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as an important sign of hope. Now, when I read that, I remembered how Francis has said in the past that when he was a seminarian, Paul VI was his great light, is what he called him. And this is the same Paul VI who said that the UN, as we just mentioned, is the people's last hope of concord and peace. So evidently, Francis considers Agenda 2030 to be the instrument of that hope for concord and peace. So Gallagher went on, again, representing the Holy See, unholy See in this case. He said, progressing on the sustainable and resilient path that we have embarked on in 2015, and by the way, this is the second mention of 2015, and it's noteworthy, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. He says, progressing on this path involves, quote, committing to and delivering on a new model of development that has the human person at its center, is geared towards the common good and grounded in ethical principles of justice, solidarity, and shared responsibility, end quote. Now, obviously, apart from Christ the King, who rules over all men and all nations, apart from the church, through which the voice of Christ the King is heard, and through which all things whatsoever that he commanded are taught, who gets to define which principles are ethical? Who gets to define what's just, what is not just, and so on? Well, obviously, it's man. So in conclusion, Gallagher wraps up his statement by saying, the Holy See is of the view that the success of the Sustainable Development Goals depends on our genuine commitment to multilateralism as the expression of a renewed sense of global co-responsibility. In other words, globalism. They're behind this 100%. It's the key to moving the Sustainable Development Goals forward. And I'm going to get to, if we have time, some of the details of what those Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 include. And it'll blow your mind that men claiming to be Catholic could get behind them. So globalism being the key, of course, Bergoglio has been sending warm messages of greeting to the World Economic Forum for years. He sends cardinals there to represent the unholy See. So he's into that 100%. So what's the significance of 2015? Well, in 2015, Agenda 2030 was in its drafting stages. And it was at that time that an archbishop from the Vatican, Alza is his last name, A-U-Z-A, he delivered a statement to the United Nations concerning the seminal document called the Zero Draft for the Sustainable Development Goals, which ultimately became Agenda 2030. His message from the Vatican to the United Nations about this 2030 Agenda draft was, quote, we support the verbatim inclusion of the Sustainable Development Goals and targets as contained in the draft. We strongly encourage the use and coordination of all sources of financing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and development in general. End quote. Now, note very well, the Archbishop is speaking on behalf of Francis, supposedly representing the Holy Roman Catholic Church. He's endorsing the draft verbatim. So keep this in mind as I point to some of the things that can be found verbatim in the text. At one point, this Archbishop Alza provides the UN with some, this is remarkable. He provides the UN with some uninvited advice on how the UN can best sell Sustainable Development Goals to those who remain unmotivated to support the agenda. He says, quote, by using brief inspirational or lead sentences, akin to the methods of social media, the political declaration should prepare us for reflection and usher in our interest in the 3 chapters. I find this laughable in a sense because he's giving them his sage advice from experience on how the Vatican, the operation, the headquarters of the Catholic Church, goes about trying to indoctrinate the people. By putting out, inspirational lead sentences and, the way we use social media. That's how the United Nations should sell SDGs moving forward. So one of the things that's included in this draft that the Vatican endorsed verbatim It calls for, quote, gender-sensitive development strategies and gender equality. Now, even though these are somewhat vague expressions, I think it's noteworthy that the homosexual journal called Advocate Magazine, the same that named Francis Person of the Year, I think 2015 or so, they applauded the statement, saying this statement is fantastic because it leaves the door open to encompass LGBT issues. That's their word. And I think they're 100% on that. Among the statements that were endorsed verbatim by Francis by way of his nuncio to the UN is the following. By 2030, ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services, including family planning, information, and education, the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. Now, obviously, these are references to contraception and abortion. We all know that. This isn't the only place where that document mentions such things. In another place, it says, we are committed to ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, family planning, reproductive health, and reproductive rights. And then it says, as agreed in accordance with the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Platform for Action. I have to stop here, Kevin, because you have a bunch of different things going on. You have the zero draft, you have the UDHR, you have the Agenda 2030 itself, you have this program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development, you have the Beijing Platform for Action. All of these things are mentioned. It gets so confusing. You'll find that if you go off on a research mission and your goal is to get your hands around what is Agenda 2030, this push for sustainable development goals that the Conciliar Church is behind 100%, is adopting verbatim 100%, is even pledging financial support to move along. What is it? What does it stand for? Well, you're going to find that you're not going to be able to attain that answer in one place and just in a concise layout of here's what we stand for, here's what we want, here's how we're going to get there. And that's by design. This is a diabolical operation. And so in order to really get your hands around what is Agenda 2030 and this thing that the Conciliar Church is endorsing 100%, what is it trying to achieve? You have to look in all these different places, different documents, different committees, different efforts, and they all come together under that one big umbrella called Agenda 2030. And so I mention that because, I'm pointing to the documents themselves point to other documents and other programs that also need to be looked at. This Beijing platform is among the things that's endorsed verbatim in the draft based on the Holy See's message to the United Nations. And it states, prevention of unwanted pregnancies must always be given the highest priority, and every attempt should be made to eliminate the need for abortion. Think about the words here, the need for abortion. It's needed. We should avoid it if we can, but sometimes we need it, is what this document's saying. And yet the unholy see is delivering a message to the UN saying we endorse this verbatim. This document also says fertility, reproductive and mental health, and contraceptive practice should be promoted, as well as research on treatment of complications of abortions and post-abortion care. And as for why contraceptive practice should be promoted, the platform tells us. And in this, it goes full-blown Marxist. It says early childbearing continues to be an impediment to improvements in the educational, economic, and social status of women in all parts of the world. Overall, for young women, early marriage and early motherhood can severely curtail educational and employment opportunities and are likely to have long-term adverse impact. So think about what's being said in this document. Again, one that the unholy see has endorsed verbatim. It's going so far as to denigrate motherhood, but not just unwed motherhood, which you could understand some cautionary words about unwed motherhood coming from a document that the church would choose to endorse verbatim. But this thing is denigrating motherhood even in the context of marriage. And that's a totally Marxist principle. I recently reread the Communist Manifesto, and it explicitly denigrates the family and the fact that mothers who are means of production themselves, that they need to be in the workplace, and that the economic impact of having mothers at home caring for children is a negative thing in their opinion. So the other thing that this platform puts out there is a series of cautions against unsafe abortions, as if there's anything such as a safe abortion. Obviously, there is no such thing. The little human beings that are mutilated in the process, there is no safety to be had in abortion. And yet this document states, quote, unsafe abortions threaten the lives of a large number of women. Okay. Actions to be taken, recognize and deal with the health and impact of unsafe abortion as a major public health concern. Unsafe abortion is defined as a procedure for terminating an unwanted pregnancy, either by persons lacking the necessary skills or in an environment lacking the minimal medical standards. So in other words, abortion it's needed at times, and it can be unsafe unless the person doing it is certified. This is the kind of stuff that the headquarters of the Conciliar Church under Bergoglio, and probably would have been under some of his predecessors, let's be honest, has endorsed verbatim. And so that's it. I'm going to stop throwing quotes at you from this reprehensible effort called Agenda 2030 and this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it should be perfectly clear to anybody with an open mind that this operation in Rome today, the Conciliar Church, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons to say it's obviously not the Catholic Church. The men running it obviously are not vicars of Christ. But if this doesn't do it, I'm sorry, Kevin, I guess nothing will.
Well, and it's fitting in a way that I just recorded yesterday a show with Mario Dirksen where he, from a totally different angle, approaches the fact that he cannot be the Pope. More, I guess theologically, but it shows you too. Again, you can look at it just even common sense or practically. Look at these things. You cannot be the vicar of Christ and promote these things, as you said, and promote them verbatim, and then never have to walk them back. And that's something. I mean, Louis, how does he get away with this stuff? I just don't understand. I mean, I understand that people, just kind of, especially the recognize and resist are kind of like, yeah, la la la. I'm just not going to hear it. But I mean, how is nobody talking about this? I hadn't heard about this until you just told me. I mean, how is no one saying, "Hey, yeah, the Vatican signed off on Agenda 2030"? I had never heard that. That's wild. That is, and I think if people actually knew that, I think they would. I think their minds would be blown. I don't know what they would think.
Yeah, you would think they would, Kevin. But there's other people doing way more in-depth work than what I just laid out here, exposing the United Nations and Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and how evil they are. But I don't know what the barrier is. I really don't. And this is like often guys like you and I, we talk about things probably more akin to your conversation with Mario the other day that you just mentioned. They're a little bit more theological, but this is the kind of stuff it's so basic. You know what I mean? It's basic to the point where even a moderately conservative person who sincerely wants to be Catholic can look at this stuff and say, that's not Catholic. The Catholic Church can't get behind any of it. The Catholic Church, in fact, really needs to stand up and flat out condemn it. So, yeah, it's a mystery to me why so many people, well, I think people do see some of this and just maybe, I really don't know the answer. By the grace of God, the eyes eventually will have to be open, but I'm afraid it's going to be too late at that point. These things are coming, and the Conciliar Church, even though it's an imposter and a counterfeit church, it wields a lot of power on planet Earth. It surely does. It's an instrument of Satan, and it's not as though he's lacking power in this world. He's the prince of this world. And by virtue of the endorsement that the Conciliar Church is giving to this evil agenda, it is definitely having an impact and helping to move it forward.
Well, and we see it again, it goes all the way back to the 1940s. I'm sure before that, I mean, this plan has been a long time in the making. I mean, whoever you want to say is behind it, as you said, for sure, we know it's the devil. I mean, whoever else you want to put behind it, we don't know, probably never will. But it's clearly a plan that's in motion, and a plan that has a date. I mean, that they're saying Agenda 2030. I mean, that's pretty scary, and I think that it is something that I'm not a believer in, that we should just think it's the end of the world and woe is me, oh, let's go sit in our chairs and cry a little bit about it. I don't believe that. I think we need to live our lives and enjoy our lives, live for God, etc. But I think we do need to also have our eyes open and say, there's stuff coming. It is coming down the pike. And I think, I guess as they say, knowledge is power. And I think it's good to know. And it's good to know that these things are connected with Rome, because I did not know that. I really didn't. I mean, I've heard all the time about 2030. I know some of the things. I know plenty of the issues with what the UN is trying to do. I did not know that it gets the approval of Rome. And I guarantee you most people listening to this didn't either. So please, if you're listening to this, watching this, share it with your family and friends, really, because this is something, these types of things can really change someone's heart. I really think that if someone hears, wow, Bergoglio is supporting the UN agenda that supports abortion and contraception, woof, that, okay, can the Pope do that? I mean, then maybe they're going to actually start thinking about it.
I would hope so. Kevin, after we finish this program, I'll email to you some links
Great.
to articles, AKA Catholic. I quoted from them in large measure in this conversation. So if people want to go there and just have the words written out and see some of the things in writing, I think it might be a little bit helpful. One thing I would mention, so it is interesting that it's dated, right? It's not like, we have to sit back and wonder when it's all going to come to fruition. They've got a plan. They've got a timeline. And more as the years go on and we get closer to 2030, the language coming from the UN, there's more and more urgency to it. It's like, now's the time. We really need to refocus our efforts. They're really focused on that year, 2030. And I find it interesting that, Our Lady of Fatima told Sister Lucia that a time would come when she would come back to request the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart. And that in the aftermath of that, this period of peace would ensue in the world. Okay. And that, the warning if it didn't happen. So in subsequent years, our Lord, in visions to Sister Lucia, said that if the popes don't consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that the popes will suffer the same fate as the King of France when they refused to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And what happened in there, it was 100 years to the day, pretty much 100 years to the year later, that during the French Revolution, the King of France was killed, his head chopped off. So something cataclysmic and terrible is going to happen unless after 100 years, the consecration of Russia doesn't take place. Well, it ends up, it was 1929, actually, even though the visions of Our Lady of Fatima took place in 1917, the request for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart did not take place until 1929. That's when the request was formally made. So 2029 is something of a drop dead date on God's timeline. So I think he's in control of human history. Now, there's going to be hell to pay for all of us, I guess, if it is explicit request on the part of our Lord to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary is not taken seriously and carried forward. But I think it's interesting. 2029 is coming first. So we'll see. For all the best laid plans of these diabolical men, something's going to happen. I have a feeling it's not going to go exactly the way they want it to go. It may not be a ride for us, but it's not going to go their way.
I like how you think. I totally agree with you that the devil is not going to win this. We know that for absolute certain. And for everyone, I mean, again, remember, we have to do our part, and that is definitely prayer, sacrifice, and living the best lives we can. I mean, maybe in the grand scheme, we feel like, oh, there's what can we do? It's so beyond us, but we are part of the mystical body of Christ. We actually do play a part. Every single thing that we do plays a part in the war of good versus evil. And it sounds maybe extreme, but it's absolutely true. So every prayer we pray, every sacrifice we make does actually help whatever the solution is going to be, whatever God has determined. And I think that's something that should give us a little bit of a boost, maybe get us on our knees to pray the rosary like Our Lady of Fatima asked. That's what I mean, it's just an amazing thing. It's like, how many things did she ask of us? Not that much, consecrate Russia, pray the rosary, and honor her in her Immaculate Heart. I mean, she didn't ask that much. We can do it.
Sure. Absolutely. We have reason for hope, Kevin, always. We know who wins in the end, but there's going to be suffering. There's no doubt about that. But as Catholics, we know the suffering is the gateway to glory. That's what saved the world. That's what redeemed the world, was the suffering of our Lord. But
Perfect. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Mr. Louie Verrecchio, aka Catholic.com. Definitely go check out his stuff. Again, it's really, really good. You got a backlog too. And support Louie, please. Again, there are not many people out there telling the truth. I mean, really count them on one hand, maybe. I mean, aren't many people doing it. I mean, actual journalism, actually trying to dig into these things. It really matters. It really makes a difference. So go support Louie, aka Catholic.com. Read his stuff and support him as well to help it. Because again, as we've said so many times, if you support him, he can likely do more stuff. So that's just how this works, So I'm sure you'd have more time. So help him out. And like, share, subscribe, comment, all this stuff for the video, because this is a good one. This is one that I think really could change some people's minds. Louie, thank you so much. And until next time, God bless you.
always a pleasure. Thank you.